I have been doing a revision, working my way through Romans. We have looked at chapter 1, where Paul sets forth, after the introduction in the first 17 verses, how that the Gentiles are guilty before the Lord. And then in chapter 2, he comes to show that the Jewish readers of his book uh, are going to be guilty as well, so that everyone is in need of the righteousness of Christ. And what we covered last time, I'm trying to hold it to as close as I can to 15 minutes. We covered 2:1 to 16, where Paul talks about the righteous judgment of God, how that everyone is going to be judged righteously by the Lord, whether one is Jewish or Gentile. Everyone is going to have someday, all of us, a righteous judgment from the Lord. So then Paul, in verse 17 and following, begins to talk to the people of his day, the Jewish leaders who took pride in knowing the Torah. And so he begins to talk about that. And what I'd like to do, I'd like to read the Greek text or translate the Greek text along with a running commentary. So we begin at verse 17. If you are named a Jew and rest in the law and boast in God, and you know the will of God, and you test the things that are differing, being instructed in the law. Notice here that Paul gets very specific, addressing the Jewish audience of his day. And Paul was Jewish, by the way. And so he's showing how everyone, including himself and the Gentiles and Jew and Gentile, are all in need of the righteousness of God in Christ. So he says, you rest in the law and you boast in God, which was a characteristic of the Jewish rabbis at that time and others who were proud to be Torah people and feel that being Jewish would put them in favor with God and lovers of the Torah. We all should be lovers of the Torah, of the word, but Paul is taking it on to say, as we'll see, if you don't keep the Torah, what does that mean? So he goes on, he says, you claim to know the will of God and you discern the things that are differing. In other words, the Jewish teachers, especially at that time, felt that they knew the Torah and what it was all about, and they could discern between things clean and unclean according to legal pronouncement. So Paul goes on, having persuaded yourself that you are a guide of the blind, a light of those in darkness, an instructor of the unwise, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and truth in the law. Paul then says, he describes characteristically the Jewish teachers of his day. You are persuaded, he says, that you yourselves are a guide to the blind, and that you are able to help those blind people, especially the Goyim, especially the Gentiles. You feel that you are a light to those in darkness. That is, that you basically know the truth and you're able to bring light to those in the darkness. You are convinced, Paul says, that you are instructor to the foolish, a teacher of infants, and that you have an understanding of the law and truth. Paul is actually now characterizing an attitude that was often dominant at that time among many of his contemporaries, fellow Jewish contemporaries. It is interesting, by the way, this is not anti-Semitism. Paul is simply addressing, as a Jew himself, the need of the righteousness of God ultimately in Christ. And if you have the Torah and don't keep it, what does it mean? This will be his argument. So we move on to verses 21 and 22. Therefore, now notice how Paul begins to apply it. The one who teaches another, do you teach yourself? With a series of questions. The one who preaches, do not steal, do you steal? The one who says, do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? The one who abhors idols, do you rob the temples of idols? In these verses, Paul is continuing saying, you teach somebody else, but you don't really do it yourself. You don't really teach yourself. The one who preaches or proclaims that you should not steal, do you steal? That's Paul's question. Evidently, there were those breaking one of the basic 10 commandments, that of stealing, while they taught others that they should not steal. Then, the one who says, do not commit adultery, Paul asks, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob the temple of idols or the temples of idols? Now, this is an interesting text. It seems to me that what Paul is referring to is that some would often go into the temples of pagan gods and steal their idols to decorate their homes, thus committing idolatry. At least that is what it seems to me that Paul is saying here. Then in verse 23, you who boast in the Lord or in the law, through the transgression of the law, you are dishonoring God. In other words, you're boasting in the law, but by transgressing it, you really are dishonoring God, Paul's argument is. And the name of God is being blasphemed among the Gentiles, just as it has been written. Here the Apostle Paul is quoting Isaiah 52, verse 5, and Ezekiel 36:20. I mean, that background to say, from what even Isaiah had said, that you're doing the same thing now, and the Gentiles, among them, the name of God is being slandered or blasphemed. And by the way, just to make an application, we who believe in Jesus as Christians, what are we doing in the way that we conduct our lives, the way that we conduct ourselves? Are we causing the name of God to be blasphemed, the name of Christ, by not really doing what he said? He said, if you love me, keep my commandments. So as we look at 23 and 24, Paul is saying that they who boast in the law through the transgression of the law are dishonoring God. They break the Torah, and by transgressing it, then they actually dishonor God, Paul is saying. And in the name of God, his name is then being slandered among the Gentiles. The Gentile neighbors that watch you, Paul is saying, slander the God that you say that you serve. So basically, you are preaching one thing, is his argument, but doing another. This is really what Paul is saying at this time. And like I said, we have to be very careful of that in the Christian church. We can talk about loving our neighbor as ourselves, but do we really do it? We can talk about prejudice, but are we prejudiced in certain ways? So in other words, this has ongoing application, not just at that time, but I think through our time today. So then as we come to verses 25 to 27, notice Paul continues, for circumcision is profiting if you practice the law. But if you are a transgressor of the law, then your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if the uncircumcision practice or do the righteous requirements of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted unto circumcision, or as circumcision? And so Paul then goes on, and the one out of nature, the uncircumcised out of nature, is judging the uncircumcised is judging the one literally out of nature, that is like a Gentile. He is judging you by fulfilling the law, and on account of the letter and circumcision, that you now are a transgressor of the law. In other words, I think what he's saying here is that the one that is a Gentile is really, who's uncircumcised, is actually judging you who have the circumcision and everything. So he continues in my understanding, by saying that circumcision has value if you keep the law. However, if one is a transgressor of the law, then circumcision has become as though it is uncircumcision. And then he goes on to say, because there was this pride, not only pride, but let's say necessary element in the thinking of Paul's contemporaries, you need to be circumcised. And some people have applied this to baptism. If you've been baptized, you've made it, something like that. And then Paul goes on to say, and will not the uncircumcised by nature, that is the Gentile, who is uncircumcised from nature, unlike you as a Jew, is his argument, will not those who are uncircumcised condemn you, judge you as a Jew, since they are keeping the law by obeying what the law says, even though they don't have the law, by obeying it? Will he not judge you, is Paul's argument, as a Jew and as a teacher, even though you have the Torah written, you have the written Torah and have circumcision, and yet you are a transgressor of the law? That seems to be Paul's argument. And we can struggle with the same thing today, even though we have, let's say, prayer meetings, Sunday school, we know theology, we've studied it. If we're not living what Christ said, will not sometimes the person doesn't even have that become a judge of us? So this can have application, I think, in the life of people in the church as well. So then we move on to verses 28 to 30. For the Jew is not one openly or that you can see manifestly, that you can see. Neither is the one openly in the, neither is circumcision, we could say, openly in the flesh. In other words, it's not an external thing, I believe is Paul's argument. But and the Jew is in secret, and circumcision is of the heart by the Spirit, not the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. And so Paul is saying the true Jew is one who has a circumcised heart. It's not just the external. And so as I look at these verses, if those who simply have exterior circumcision and the letter of the law, but break it and don't do it, then they are not going to receive God's grace. Basically, this is a statement where Paul goes back to strong biblical grounds. The most important thing is not what you appear in the outward form, but it is the circumcision of the heart that really makes you a true Jew, is his argument, I believe. It is by the Spirit, not the letter, whose praise then is not of men externally, like Paul's argument you are seeking, but of God. So Paul goes back to Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, where Deuteronomy talks about the need of the circumcision of the heart. Jeremiah, by the way, does the same thing in Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 4. The Gentiles have been, let's say, prosecuted in chapter 1. And now Paul is showing how God brings judgment upon the Jewish teachers of the Torah of his day, who are being prosecuted before God's tribunal here in chapter 2, because they do not really keep the law, is his argument. By the way, Paul is using a very common imagery, or very common method here of what is called the Rib, R-I-B. The Rib means lawsuit. It was sort of funny when I was teaching years ago. One of the students was studying to be a veterinarian, and she took my course, and I was explaining the Rib is like a lawsuit. We have it in the Hebrew Bible a lot. In Isaiah chapter 1, we have a lawsuit where God is bringing Israel into court. That's what I believe is going on here. And she laughed. She wrote on her exam, the only rib I know about is the rib of an animal. But it's interesting. We're looking at the idea of a lawsuit here. So everybody is guilty. Whether we are talking about the Jewish teacher of that time, or whether we are talking about the Gentile, everyone. And as I said, we could say that the non-believer is guilty because he has not responded to the law of nature, the law of conscience, the law of right and wrong. C.S. Lewis, in his great book, Mere Christianity, talks about where does the idea of right and wrong come from if there's not a creator who made that and placed that in people. Why would that even be there if there was not a personal God who defined right and wrong in the conscience? So I think the idea here is that the non-believer is guilty because he hasn't responded to the law of conscience. But the churchgoer, if we could apply it to today, Paul would argue, is also guilty by having the word and priding themselves, for example, in their baptism, or by going to church every Sunday. Nothing wrong with going to church, but if that becomes the basis of one's standard of righteousness, and yet not really living up to what the word is showing, then is there really genuine faith? In other words, we often heard the statement, one needs to walk the talk. And that's what Paul is saying. So Paul is saying that everybody then stands as we conclude chapter 2 under the judgment of God and under the wrath of God, whether Jew or Gentile. Everyone, therefore, has a need, therefore, of what what Paul is going to apply is that everyone has a need of what Christ can bring. That is the righteousness of God that is found in him. And he'll develop that then more fully as we continue thinking through Romans.